Hello, good evening, everybody.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening,
Good
ma'am.
evening.
Evening, ma'am.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Yes,
Ma'am.
ma'am.
Good
Hello.
evening, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
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 Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello. Hello.
ma'am. We can hear you. I think you can't hear us.
Yes, ma'am. You are audible. You are audible.
Okay. Okay. So you're so very silent today. So I thought you're not able to hear me. Okay. You are yes, I am audible. I know. So just give me 1 minute. So yesterday I taught you Victorian literature and something was left after that. So I thought I'll continue today. So today usually it comes as a short question to you people. It will come in examination. That is the pre-Raphaelite movement. It is at the latter half of the Victorian period. We have a movement which was inspired by the art form. You can say the painting, and it was called the pre-Raphaelite movement, and also it was popularly known as the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. So it was a group of yes, English painters, poets, art critics, and it was founded in 1848 by William Holman Hunt, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, he was the pioneer, and also Michael Rossetti, and a group of others, which the Dante Gabriel Rossetti is the most important. Okay, let me tell you, I have shared my notes with Promise. Promise, have you? I think you have received my notes. You're not acknowledging, so I don't come to know whether you have received it or not.
Ma'am, we have received it, ma'am.
Just now, did I send it to you?
No, ma'am, you sent it to Promise. She
Did I
has
send it to
shared
you?
us in the group.
Please
No, ma'am.
unmute yourself and tell me who has received.
Ma'am, you have sent it to Promise, I
Unmute yourself
suppose.
and tell me
She
who
have
has
sent it
received
to
my
me, ma'am. She have sent it in the group, ma'am, to everyone.
I'm not able to hear. What is the problem?
I think there is some technical problem.
No,
Ma'am can't hear us.
no one. I think now I can hear. Yeah. Actually, it was shared.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So who is the may I know whose mail ID is Promise? Who is she?
Ma'am,
Who is she?
mine.
Promise. What's
Ma'am
your name?
Arshi.
Yeah.
Ma'am Arshi Khurana. Ma'am Arshi.
Arshi. Okay. So I have sent you, and please acknowledge, madam, you have received it, because if you don't acknowledge, I don't know whether you have received it or not. Because I'm sending it to you, at least have the courtesy to say, madam, have the acknowledge. Last time also I sent
Ma'am,
you did not acknowledge. No, you should
sorry,
acknowledge.
ma'am.
No, it's not a question of sorry.
Ma'am, I have shared with everyone.
No, it's not a question of
Ma'am, I have
sharing.
shared.
At times through the
Yeah.
technical thing, I am sending it to you, whether you're receiving it or not, or whether it has gone somewhere else. At times it goes to the spam, at times it goes to the trash. So I'm not able to know. So if I'm sending you the files, please acknowledge, madam, I have received it. Then I'm sure that you have received it.
ठीक है मैम.
Okay, do that. Yeah.
Okay मैम.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the pre-Raphaelite movement, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and this usually comes as a short note. And his sister was Christina Rossetti. So these were the group of young British painters, and they reacted against the unimaginative and artificial way of expressing. They wanted to have a new sort of expression, and they were more inspired by the classical paintings, and also they were also influenced by the romantics. So it was more about nature, about painting. That is how they expressed themselves, and it was a very sort of sensuous poetry, it was a form of sensuous poetry. And the best known poem of Dante Gabriel Rossetti was The Blessed Damozel. You share it with you, please have this discussion amongst you. You should not, this should not pop up during my classroom. So that is, you create your WhatsApp group, who has received, who has not received. That is your problem. I have sent it. My problem is over. So now how you share it, it should not disturb my class. So this poem was first published in 1850 in the Pre-Raphaelite Journal, and it was subsequently revised twice. And again, it was republished in 1856, 1870, 1873, because it's a very popular poem. And this poem was inspired by Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven. The Raven, there's another poet, great poet, Edgar Allan Poe, and he had written a poem called The Raven. And Rossetti was inspired by this poet, and he wrote this poem. No, please mute yourself. And the poem describes a lover grieving, feeling sad, grieving on earth over the death of his beloved. This is the theme of the poem. So here, that is the original poem of Edgar Allan Poe, where he depicts a lover grieving on earth the death of his loved one. But Rossetti just reverses the situation, and here Rossetti describes the damozel. Damozel means the girl, observing her lover from heaven and her unfulfilled yearning for their reunion in heaven. So Edgar Allan Poe had written how the beloved has died and how the lover feels sad on earth. But here the situation becomes a little different, where the damozel or the beloved is in heaven, and she is yearning for the lover to join her, to have the reunion in heaven. So this is a very positive poem, you can say, and there's nothing much about to understand. There's no symbol, anything, but it's just a love sensuous poem. And he had a sister, Christina Rossetti. She also wrote poems, and she's famous for writing ballads and religious lyrics, and it was all very intense poems. So the famous poems she wrote were Goblin Market and other poems, and it was published in 1862. And this Goblin Market, it's a fantastic fairy tale, which was, it's about it's more like a fairy tale, nothing to do with the reality of the world. And it was much criticized, also much critically analyzed by the critics, because they didn't want a fairy tale to be told at this age of Victorian age, you can say. So she herself says, I don't want to write something very profound. Whether it is, I mean, real or unreal, I don't mind. It's not, I have nothing profound. But I just wanted, whatever I wanted to write, it's my poetic voice. So this is about Christina Rossetti and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And this is about pre-Raphaelite movement. So pre-Raphaelite movement usually comes as a short question. So you have to be prepared to write this short note about Dante Gabriel Rossetti and his sister Christina Rossetti, how it was a movement of the painters and they appreciated art, and there's nothing very symbolic, nothing to do with the reality. It was more about love, passion, right? And the famous poem was The Blessed Damozel, where he talks about the lover, beloved, who is separated from her lover. She goes to heaven and she wishes the beloved, I mean, to come to her, and she is convinced that definitely he will come one day dressed in a white robe with a halo around his head, and then they can go around under the tree, enjoying tree of life, enjoying life in heaven. So this is about the Blessed Damozel. So it is a fantasy, you can say it's a wish poem, fantasy, and there's nothing serious about it. It's all about love. Next, we go to the serious poets of, now we go to the modern poets. And the first modern poet, which I'm going to discuss today, is, tell you, inform you more about what is modern poetry. Then I will come to the poet so that it becomes easy for you to understand. So modern poetry. So this started at the late Victorian age, you can say. Yeah. And this period, number of movements took place. Number of literary movements like expressionism, impressionism, symbolism, imagism. These are the movements, different sorts of movements that took place. So if I say it is expressionism, anyone who has an idea what is called an expressionism? Anyone who can tell me what is expressionism?
Excuse me?
Yes, tell me, Param.
Which expresses the subjective mood of the author
Poet. Yeah.
in a symbolic way.
That expresses the inner mind, right? The inner mind of the author. Nothing to do with the objective world, but it is more an expression of the inner self of the poet. So usually that is done through images. You can only relate to that author or to that idea or to that narrative through some images, because it is not a very direct way of understanding. And another is the symbolism. Symbolism and expressionism both are related. Yes, subjective emotions, yes. So these are symbolism. For example, I don't know whether you have read it or not. I must have read it. Absurd Theatre. Have you gone to the Absurd Theatre? Anyone?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Waiting for Godot.
Yeah, Waiting for Godot. In
Yes.
that Waiting for Godot, yes. In Waiting for Godot, what happens? There is a tree. There are two characters. There are only two
Vladimir.
characters.
Yes.
Vladimir and
Estragon. Estragon.
Estragon. Yeah, Estragon and Vladimir, they are the two characters, and it is a tree which has no leaves at all. And they're waiting under a tree, and every time they're questioning, is Godot going to come? And the spelling is Godot. Godot. So T is silent. Is Godot going to come? The other one says, yes, Godot is going to come. Is Godot going to come? Yes, Godot is going to come. So what does it symbolize? It is symbolize that modern world, which is a barren world, modern world, which is not full of foliage, greenery, but everything is, dreary, rootless. In that situation, you'll find the two people waiting for whom? Waiting for hope. Waiting for hope. Hope is, they're waiting that something would happen in their life. Or are they waiting for the Christ to come and redeem these characters from the present situation? But they're waiting. So this waiting is an endless waiting. So this is the scenario of the modern world where nothing happens. This is a barren world. It's a sterile world where nothing happens. Even the tree is not a green tree. It's a totally barren sort of tree without any leaves. But they are having a dog, I think, with their hand. They have a chained dog. And the two characters are waiting. And every time one is questioning the other, is Godot going to come? Yes, Godot. Can we go? No, we can't go. We have to wait. So they are in a stalemated situation, that is called stalemate, where neither you can go forward nor you can go backward, but you are stuck. So in this modern world, people are stuck. That is what he wants to portray. So this is done through the symbol. This is done through because if you see the story, it is nothing. It is nothing. Just two characters and a tree and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. And every time they're questioning, can we go? No, we cannot go. Can we come? No. We have to wait. Yes. Is he going to come? Is he going to come? Perhaps he will come. Yes, he will come. So these are the types of replies they're getting from each other. So this is the endless waiting. So this is the, you can say, the milieu of the modern world. That is what the author wants to say. So this is called symbolism, right? Imagism. And the other one is existentialism. What is this existentialism? Can anyone say? Please unmute and say one. Only one. I want to hear from, if you know, have any idea what is called existentialism. You have to be familiar with these words. Existentialism, imagism, expressionism. I know these are the movements because, they tried. Modern age was an age of experiment. They were experimenting with different sorts of movements. And that is how they coined these words. And existentialism means where a situation, again, it's about a world where everything is about your existence, about whether what should one do in this world. A very depressive situation, that is called an existentialism, right? And this is, if you have read this myth of Sisyphus, there is a novel, myth of Sisyphus, where Sisyphus is trying to push a boulder, and every time he pushes that boulder, the boulder comes back. Again he's trying, and the trying is endless. He tries to push that boulder and he goes on doing it. So that means what? This sort of existence where, it is by Albert Camus, and it's a beautiful read, I tell you. It's a beautiful read where the modern world has been described, how hopeless this world is, when nothing happens. And one is always striving. This is the world where everyone is striving. Everyone is, facing a challenge in life. This is the existential world. That is, the movement started, existentialism. Yeah, you can say meaningless, you can say nihilism, nihilistic world, where nothing happens, and a very negative sort of existence of mankind, nothing to be positive about. So that was called existentialism. So this was modern poetry. They experimented with different types of forms. And so this is, as a result, to have not a very particular way of, there's no particular trend. There are different trends, cross currents of literary forms, converging, merging, and this is how this modern literature is. So it is more about the skepticism of this world. Nothing is very jolly, nothing is very, very fruitful. It's not a very hopeful world. The world is always a crumbling world. It is a world where everything is going to shatter. The dreams are going to be shattered, hope is going to be shattered, and everything is nothing is very positive. They're not hoping that God will be there in the nature, and someone is there to heal your feelings. Nothing like that. But it shows the reality where, what is the reality of the modern world? Because this is the post colonial world, this is the post industrial world, and it is an urban world. So we have forgotten nature. When nature is forgotten and the relationship of man with man has been disturbed, what will be that world like? What will be the world like? It will be a futile world. It will be a sterile world where everything is a meaningless thing. There's no chain, because the chain of being, when something is disturbed, everyone becomes a victim of that. Everyone becomes a victim of that, like nature, man, God. There's a chain, but that's all related. Now the chain has been disturbed, has broken due to many factors. Due to the policy taken by the nations, due to the world wars, due to the urbanization. So the attitude of the people have also changed along with the physical changes of the world. So the modern society is a fragmented society. And when the world is fragmented, when the modern situation is fragmented, naturally, the reality that would be depicted would also be a fragmented reality. It will be a fragmented reality. Nothing is very comprehensive. Nothing is very, at one go you can find this is this. No, everything is broken. Everything is shattered. This is the modern world. And when you talk of the modern world, you can say, what is the features? What are the features? The first feature is the realism. Modern literature is very realistic. There is no fantasy. Imagination is not there at all, but it is more of expressing the truth happening around your life, happening around in this world. And it was also a reaction against the romantic fervor of the situation of the century, because this romanticism continued for a long time, and they revolted against all that. They say it's a pseudo thing. It is a hypocritical thing when people are suffering, when wars are happening, world is scrambling, world is shattering. Why do we talk of romanticism here? So it was a movement against that. So they started seeing life as it is, And so Robert Frost, Gibson, and you can say Yeats, Eliot, all these were realistic poets. And the other thing was the love. The treatment of love also changed. It was many poems, lyrics were written in blank verse, free verse, but it is not about a very positive love, a love where it's more of dejection, a love where people don't promise and they forget their promises, and one is deceiving the other. This is the state of love in modern poetry. So the romance, you can say, the romantic spirit, that somehow disappeared in the modern literature. Of course, there are some poets like Walter de la Mare and all. They wrote romantic poems. There are also, not that everyone is writing about the real world and what it is, but it was a romantic world, and it bordered on supernaturalism. This when Walter de la Mare wrote. And for nature, that nature was had a different treatment, and sorry, I'm having a cup of coffee to myself. And nature here is not a preacher. Nature is not a mystic. There's nothing spiritual about nature, but nature gives the reality of this world. Also, it talks about birds, clouds, landscapes, sea, countryside. Everything has been expressed. There are poets who have expressed, but they have not romanticized as the romantics have romanticized. They don't romanticize. And the modern poets are very democratic. They were more interested in the life of the human beings. They saw the struggle of people, and all this, the hope of a common man, the frustration of a common man, and the sufferings. This were themes of the poetry of modern poets. So as modern age is the age of science, also, though it is an age of science, we have also some poets like Yeats, W.B. Yeats, who was a mystic poet. He wrote through symbols, and a lot of mysticism is there in his poem, of course. And there were like Robert Graves, another poet, who also was a mystic poet. And they kept alive the spirit of mysticism and also superstition in their poems. So it's not that everything was very cynical or very, very pessimistic. And about the expression of the modern poets, very direct, very simple, all written the free verse. There is no meter, and it was a total freedom. There's shackles from meter. They're free from the shackles of meter. And there are on diverse themes. They wrote on diverse themes. They're on the modern. They could wrote on tram. They wrote on car. They wrote on trains. They wrote on telephone. They wrote on human being. They wrote about whales, hills. Everything was the subject of that poetry. So there are different phases in modern poetry. So the first phase was dominated by T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. And these poets talked about the experiences of this complex world, of this heterogeneous civilization, where nothing is in harmony. Nothing is in harmony. They talked about that world. So all these modes, I told you, symbolism, impressionism, imagism, all these modes of writing, you can say, this vehicle of writing, you can say, vehicle of expression, this found a place in Eliot's poems, because Eliot's poems are very difficult to understand because it's mostly through the symbols he talks. And he talks about the conscious. He talks about the unconscious. Because, they say that human mind, of course, you must be, it's anyone who's taken the subject of psychology, you know that there are 3 layers of one's consciousness, human mind. One is the conscious layer, one is the subconscious layer, and the third is the unconscious layer. The 3 layers. So what happens? There was a movement in modern literature that was called the stream of consciousness. And James Joyce, a novelist, he had written on this style. What is this called? A stream of consciousness? Stream of consciousness is like in our mind, the thoughts, here, Virginia Woolf, the thoughts flow like a stream, where the different layers, the conscious, the subconscious, and the unconscious, they merge together. Yes, The Portrait of the Artist, James Joyce, that is a famous novel where he talks about the stream of consciousness. I'll give you an example, small example to make you understand what is called stream of consciousness. For example, now you are listening to me. That is a conscious layer. You are listening to me, listening to madam. But in the subconscious, you are again remembering a day, maybe tomorrow, or some moment you're going to spend, or you have spent with some of your relatives or with your close friend or with a buddy, whoever it is. You remember that. That is simultaneous. And the unconscious is there, where all the memories of the past are all embedded into that. So if you write a novel, Example, if you write a novel about the conscious, about the subconscious, and in the right of in the form of a narrative, no one will understand what you want to say. You refer to Daisy, you refer to Chowmin, you refer to Madam, you refer to a picnic, all together. Because simultaneous thoughts are occurring in one's mind. So if you capture all the simultaneous thoughts together and want to make it into some sort of narrative, or in the form of a story you want to give it, how the story would appear? Naturally, it will be bizarre because so many images, so many characters, so many themes, it all converging in our mind. So imagine our mind is such a, such a vast sort of thing that it can accommodate anything. You may be looking at me, but thinking about something else. You may be looking about me, you may go back to the past. So the past and present and future all converge in our mind at a particular time. At a particular time. So many images just converge at one particular time. And if you want to picturize that, if you want to narrate that, how will that be? It will become very, it will be difficult to understand what you want to say. But that is what James Joyce did through the stream of consciousness. So poetry, you can say they didn't follow any norm. So the first phase was by T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, and they talked about the complex civilization, the different modes of writing they had, and they explored the new territory of the conscious, of dream, of the unconscious. The human mind was mapped by the writers. Earlier, it was an objective world to them. Objective. Whatever they saw, they wrote it and they related it. But it was not going within your mind and collecting from there. So poetry was, you can say, formless. And then it was the poetry, early poetry. Then it was the poetry of the 30s, where great poets like Auden, Stephen Spender, C.D. Louis MacNeice, these are the writers. And that was the time when the Marxism was very much in vogue, and they were influenced by the leftist ideas. So they rejected the formal style and they adopted a very natural style of writing, the colloquial style of writing, the native style of writing. And Freud was very important during this time. Marx and Sigmund Freud, who wrote about dreams. So these were the forms of poems in the 1930s. Then the poetry of the 40s, where it was again a realism. And Dylan Thomas was a very great poet of this age. And he started a new romantic style. He wanted to romanticize the contemporary world, new romantic style. So he wrote about the subconscious, about the mystic, and also he referred to the myths in his poems. And then the poetry of the 50s, where you find Philip Larkins, Kingsley, Thomas Gunn, and they focused what? They focused on the ordinary things of life, ordinary, like a church, like a stick, and yes, Russian Revolution, yes. You don't have to pop up, I know. We'll discuss, don't worry. So they started, it was an observation about the contemporary world they did, and about the very unimportant objects of the world they started writing about a church, about a garden, about a park, these objects, and they wanted to relate it to the reality of the world. And then it was the poetry of the 60s, where it was Ted Hughes, then Alan Brown John. And that time, during the 1960s, they were very much inspired by the American poetry, especially Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath was very much famous that time, and it was more of a confessional poetry. Confessional, what is happening to you inside, what to the poet tries to bring her inner mind, bring her inner self to the readers. So it was an exploration of the psyche, of the human psyche. So if it is exploration of the human psyche, then it is not real. It becomes very surreal. Real and surreal. Surreal is something very mystic, where it's not something which you can touch and see and visually feel, but it is surreal, which is there, but it is there in your mind, in your conscious and subconscious layers. And then it was very much inspired by the British pop music and all this. Also the structure of the verse also, there was a beat movement, and the structure also was influenced by the pop movement of this 1960s. So after 1960s, I think till that, I think you have 1960s. Now then after 1960s, there is a very, very modern period that you don't have anything. So now we'll go by poets. We'll go by poets. And first I will go to William Butler Yeats. W.B. Yeats. W.B. Yeats, originally, he was from Scotland, but he settled in England. So he was very much inspired by the folklore of Scotland, and that was called the Celticism, C-E-L-T-I, Celtic culture, C-E-L-T-I-C, Celtic. So the important feature in Yeats's poetry is the presence of contradictions in his poem, where he talks about self, anti-self, full moon, new moon, old order, new order, romantic, modern, flesh, spirit, mind, physical. So all these contraries, not oxymoron, the contraries are beautifully, placed in such a way that they are related to each other. The contraries are related. They are not just contraries that exist in his poem, but he beautifully relates that the contraries in his poems. And he was very much inspired by the Celtic culture, and the Celtic culture was famous for its magic, its mysticism, the occult, because it was more the magic, superstition, all this happened in that Scottish world. And as he belonged to that, he took those ideas from his native place and put it in his poems. And his famous theory is that doctrine of the mask. He says that poets always wear a mask. Poets always wear a mask. There is an inner self of the poet, and the outer self and the inner self. So he wears a mask and tells about the inner self. So that is the theory of the mask he believes in. And he uses symbols in his poem, lot of symbols in his poems. So this mask and self, one is the mask and the self, the inner self. So it is a dichotomy. It is a dualism. It is a contrary. But it exists in his poems, and I'll explain you how it exists. So he says that a character's persona is not a singular personality, but it is a diverse multiple personality. In real life also, if you just observe, people all wear masks. People all wear masks. Whatever you are, the true self, you don't express that. It is always a mask where it is a world of appearance. We put something to protect our inner self. But the identity of the inner self is in a way expressed in his poems. So that makes his poems very, very, mystical, you can say, where he talks about the inner reality and the outward reality, all this. So what is the poetic career of Yeats? We find that the early phase of Yeats is there and the later phase of Yeats is there also. In the early phase, he escaped. There is a spirit of escapism, and he wrote very lyrical poems, emotional poems, and he talked more about the folklore, about the magic, and the famous poems were The Rose, The Wind Among the Reeds, In the Seven Woods, The Wanderings of Oisin. These were the early poems. But towards the later poems, he became matured and his poems became very, very complex and very symbolic. You can say ambivalent. Ambivalence, it's not very clear what he wants to say. So early phase and the later phase, these are the two distinct, you'll find two distinct things happening in its poetry. Well, so again to say that Yeats is famous for, as I said, contradictions in both his life and his work. You'll find the romantic traits as well as the modernist traits in his poems. And he says that I am one of the last romantics. That is what he said. I am one of the last romantics situated in a modern age. So I told you that clearly he has stages in his poems as John Donne had. Of course, John Donne was very much influenced by the personal feelings, and that is how it shaped his poetry. But here, Yeats was influenced by many, many factors. So early part was the Celtic, where he was nostalgic about his own country, Celtic past. And that was the reason you find very simple poems, more about magic. And in the second phase, that was a phase of where he was in love with Maud Gonne. He loved a lady called Maud Gonne. And there was the Ireland, there was a revolt in Ireland that changed the face of Ireland. And he was also, Scottish, I'm the Irish poet, Ireland. I've been telling Scottish. So he was deeply influenced by this Irish movements. And then slowly he was aging, maturing. That the maturity of vision also came in that middle phase. And in the last phase, he looks back at life, at his career. And in the last phase, you find his poems become very, very symbolic, and it becomes very difficult also to understand. Maud Gonne, she was the daughter of a British army officer, And when she was 19, Yeats fell in love, but Morgan never reciprocated to Yeats's love. And because she was the inspiration, she was the muse for Yeats's poetry. So when Morgan married to another major, and Yeats realized that there was no place for him in her life, then he married another lady, Georgina Hyde, and then they had a happy marriage and he settled down. So in his later work, he looks back at his early poetry and he finds that it's more of a nostalgia. He has talked about the Irish nostalgia, Ireland, more of magic. But later he changed the tone. Though he was realistic, but still he was not very free from the magic spell. Always you'll find an element of magic. And the Irish turmoil also, it's very much seen in his poem, The Second Coming, where he says, one line, it is that the best lack conviction, the worst are full of passionate intensity. He talks about that. So the obscurity in Yeats's poetry is there, and it is due to his dependence on Irish mythology, magic, and occulticism, use of symbol, theory of mask. So, and he wanted to replace the Greek and Roman mythological. He didn't talk about the classical figures, but he talked more about the Irish figures, Irish folklores, mythology in his poems. So he juxtaposed, he is called a poet of juxtaposition because he writes in contrasts, I told you, the past and the present, the spiritual and the physical, the similar and the dissimilar. And that is the main reason why his poems are very obscure. Also, we find that Yeats's poetry is marked with a sense of pessimism, because that is a hallmark, the characteristic of modern poetry, as I told you. Because also he was very disenchanted in love due to Morgan's, she didn't respond. So that sort of disappointment perhaps also made his poems pessimistic. But towards the end of his life, he started philosophizing. The maturity of vision came to him and he started philosophizing in his poems, talked about more about the spirit, talked more about the flesh and the spirit, the relationship of that. And so you find everything in his poems, like mysticism, occulticism, magic, mythology, everything in one, all rolled in one in his poem. That makes his poem a little complicated and difficult to understand. And his poems, the symbols also have a touch of the supernatural also, because I told you the Irish folklore had always influenced him. And he talks about the ancient spell, the ancient superstition. And he was also an anti-war poet. He did not appreciate the war and he didn't like the war. He was against the war because he thought that the war has crumbled the modern civilization. So he believed that there should be a change of order, should be a revolutionary change. And because due to this world wars, what has happened? The things fall apart. The center cannot hold. That is a very famous line of The Second Coming. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. So like things are crumbling. So the sad reality is that this is the shattered world. So among school children was a very famous poem, Wild Swans at Cooley, and then the Byzantium, Sailing to Byzantium, and the Tower poems. So these are all his collection of poems, and I will touch upon the ones which are there in your course, because I cannot tell about everything, so I have to touch upon that. In a Selling to Byzantium, I'll just read the lines. He says, "That is no country for old men. That is no country for old men. Because the young in one another's arm, birds in the trees, these are the dying generations." He tells, an aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick. A tattered coat upon a stick. That is the picture of old age, of an aged man he gives. So you can say he's a unique poet who blends everything into his poetry. And we'll read the famous poem of W.B. Yeats, that is Selling to Byzantium. In Selling to Byzantium, it is the story. Yes, Things Fall Apart was also taken from this poem and was used by the African author Chinua Achebe. Things Fall Apart, where he talks about the Igbo community. So Selling to Byzantium, it tells the story of a man who is traveling to a new country, Byzantium. He's training to Byzantium, and it is like a spiritual resort to him. So this Byzantium was an ancient Greek colony named after Constantinople, which is situated where Istanbul and Turkey now stands. Constantinople, I think there is a place there where the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews, a holy place for that. That is a place. So that is a place in Byzantium. So he takes an actual journey to Byzantium. Yes?
Ma'am, is it Jerusalem?
Yes, ma'am.
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem.
That is a small part in Jerusalem where it is still, in controversy, where three religions occupy that. And I think, I'm not very sure, but the Christians also go, the Muslims also go, the Jews also go to that particular place. It is a small place in Jerusalem. Just give me 1 minute. Hello? हाँ नमस्कार कौन नहीं कौन हाँ वेडनेसडे ना टाइम देबे अच्छा ओके ओके हो ठीक अच्छे हाँ अरे तांकु दवा टू बी गिवन टू द लाइब्रेरी और कौन ताको हमें कहबा जे मैडम आपन को जाउछ आपन खाली लाइब्रेरी को मार्क कर देबे हमें डायरेक्टली लाइब्रेरी का हमके दबा हमें डीसी को थ्रू दे दबा जे आपन को एला दोउछ आपन जदी हबो लाइब्रेरी को जदी हबे एटा हमें आपन को थ्रू दोउछ सेटा रहिबो लाइब्रेरी हला तापर सेई दिन सेई ट्राइबल इंस्टीट्यूट को भी जीवा तमे जदी कह हाँ ट्राइबल हाँ से जो तांकर ट्रेनिंग इंस्टीट्यूट है तो हाँ तांकर हेड को दे दबा दे दी कि तमे हम फेरी आसबा टू बैक टू उत्कल यूनिवर्सिटी हला तो बुधवार दिन मत टिके मन पके दो सकाळ को टाइम कोन मते कहबो अकॉर्डिंगली आई प्रिपेयर हां ओके हाँ अच्छा ओके ओके हाँ ओके बाय हाँ So the speaker takes an actual journey to Byzantium, and this journey is a metaphorical journey of the artist, journey of the poet, and there he feels that this country, in the poem the speaker feels that the country in which he resides, where he's staying, is a no place for the old. So he wants to take this journey. He's only welcoming to the young and the promising. So it's a place for the young people. So it's no place for the old people. So he decides to travel to Byzantium and later to eternity, where age is not an issue, where he will be able to transcend his physical life. So he wants to go to that place where the age will not affect him, where it will be a transcendental world. That is a place he wants to go to. So he wishes to shell and go to that imaginary world, the fictional world of Yeats, which he has created and also named it Byzantium. And he manages to reflect this vision. The world that the poet wants to live, to sell, is Byzantium, is because this world is affected by the sensual music of singing birds, of decaying multitudinous bodies. So this is the world of decay. It is a sensual world where the people talk of sex, people talk of death, decay, people talk of death. So he wants to get rid of all that. The fish, the flesh, the foul smell. So this is what? The dying generations. These are all the dying generations, where the bird sings songs to the body, and the songs distract people. They are more taken by the music, but they are away from the world of the intellect. The intellect has no age. It doesn't say that intellect is 30, my intellect is 40, my intellect is 50. So what is intellect? Intellect is something which defies age. You may be very intellectual at the age of 80 also. So it is unaging. Age has no impact on the intellect. So that is the reason he says it justifies the existence of the old man. So when the intellect is unaging, so this signifies the existence of the old man. So it should not be that the old man should perish. Yes, the old man is the place where it is unaging intellect. They are not affected by the dying generations, but they go to some place where it is more of eternity, where they get associated. The next step would be the eternity. That is a place. So this poem is into 4 stanzas, and each containing 8 lines. And there is a rhyme scheme of the poem to give a music: A B A B A B C C. So Yeats writes this poem in iambic pentameter, and there is a rhyming couplet at the end of each stanza. So there are 5 iambs in a line, 5 iambic lines. And this poem is not only a journey to Byzantium, but it is a step taken by the poet to march towards eternity. And the poem is a sing-song poem. It has got a sing-song structure. And there's a lot of, as it's a metaphorical journey, there's a lot of references. Also, alliteration is there, music is there, irony is there, and onomatopoeia is there, where the sound is very important. And the allusions are also there. So this is about the technical device. So here he talks about the spirituality, the theme of spirituality. So if I go stanza by stanza, the first stanza he says, "This is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees." This is the country. So he says that he's sailing to Byzantium from Ireland because the country is not suitable for old people to live. Old men are shut out from that kind of life because it is a physical and a sensual life that people are leading. So he wants to go to Byzantium, where there's intellectual life which is awaiting for him. So that is the reason he says that is no country for old men, and that is the reason he has chosen to make the journey to another world. So he says, the young in one another's arms. So he gives a very idyllic picture. The young lovers are wrapped in each other's arms. The birds are singing, and it is talks about the pleasures of life. And what is the life? Life which is a dying life, which is a sensual life. So those dying generations where the salmon falls, the mackered crowded seas. The speaker seems to be commenting on the creatures who inhabit this land. He says, he talks of the beautiful creatures, but all these creatures will die one day, Bird, fish, other creatures, physical life, all this which look very beautiful, all kinds of creatures that indulge in sex, procreate, grow, but finally what happens? They die because they do not lead an intellectual life. That is the reason that they lead a very physical life, and which is a dying life. So in the next lines he says, fish, flesh or fowl, comment all summer long, whatever is begotten, born and dies, caught in that sensual music, all neglect, monuments of unaging intellect. He says that the waterfall of this country is crowded with salmon. Salmon is a type of fish. Seas are teemed, abounds with mackerel fishes. But all these creatures, like birds and fish, they do not indulge in any intellectual activity. They're only responding to the sensual music or the physical music of the world. So the great works of art, according to Yeats, never dies. Sensual music which appeal to the senses and not to the mind or the intellect, that dies. But the intellectual achievements are ageless and immortal, and so of permanent value. So this type of feeling even Keats has had. John Keats also had that beauty is truth, truth beauty. Whichever is beautiful, that appeals to the spirit, that appeals to your intellect, that is not physical, that remains forever, that is univocal, because that is a form of beauty. So he says in the stanza 2, he comes to stanza 2, says, an aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick. How does a aged man look? He looks like a tattered coat upon a stick. If you wrap a stick, put a coat around the stick, that is how an old man looks. So that is a bitter tone, he says, and he's very realistic in giving the portrayal of an old man. He looks very small. When you grow in age, the body starts shrinking. So when the body starts shrinking, you become very small. The person, looks very small, very paltry, and that sort of, you can say that having a broad chest, broad shoulder, that thing shrinks. It is a shrinking age. So it's like a stick wearing a torn jacket. So he talks about the old man, but the soul of the old man, there is a soul also inside the old man, that is clapping and laughing and enjoying, singing loudly, because the soul of the old man is not affected by time. So he's, as a poet himself, he's making a journey, he's sailing away. He says, what is the benefit of the country? That he says that old man may look worthless. Old man physically is worthless. It's like look a tattered coat. He looks like a scarecrow. But if you talk about the soul of the man, the soul clap its hands and sing and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. We are wearing a mortal dress. Everyone in this world is wearing a mortal dress, that which will perish, which will die one day. So he says that unless the soul here feels thrilled, it claps, sings a happy. So that is a state of what? That is a state of spiritual exaltation. That is a state of transcendence. So he says louder he sings. For he means that the more worn out his bodily dress, the louder the soul sings. That means the soul is not affected at all by the bodily, the wearing out of the bodily dress. So the body might change. The body might start, day by day, the body is shrinking. The body is becoming old, physically getting, affected. But the soul is not affected at all. So the speaker informed the reader that the more tattered a dress is, the louder he sings, because the age has no impact on the soul. So in the lines last, there is singing, nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnificence, and therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. In this section, he says that the best music for the soul of an old man is what? Is studying. Is study and appreciating the grand monuments of immortal intellect. Grand monuments means piece of art. So when you appreciate art, when you read a lot of books, then the soul doesn't die. The soul is becoming richer and richer through this intellectual wealth. So when this old age is accompanied by a spiritual richness, then you start appreciating that great works of art, because you understand the importance of all that. So the soul of the old man must be strong, and it is not affected by youth. That is the reason he says we should go to Byzantium, the holy city of Byzantium, where it is an aesthetic city and it's a religious city. Lot of spiritual things happen there, and it is not that is affected by the physical thing or the sensual music. So in the last stanza he says, O sages, standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of a wall. So he sees the painting, I think, on the wall, and he looks at that, the murals, that on the walls, it's there. And he sees the wise people in the wall, and he appeals to the sages that is inscribed on the wall, who are standing in God's holy fire, and they are purged souls. Purged means they are transcended souls. They are not affected by this sensual world. So they are purged, they are clean souls. So they look like figures, as if representing the gold mosaic of a wall. So they are in the gold mosaic of the wall. Then he addresses, O sages, he addresses the saints. By standing in the God's holy fire, the poet refers to the saints who are purged, are cleansed souls. Through what? Through salvation. These are all very religious concepts. Through penance, through salvation. So as in the gold mosaic of a wall, The poet means that the figures that were represented in the gold mosaic, it refers to the gold mosaic in Italy, where he had seen an artistic pattern of various colors that is portrayed on the wall. He says, come from the holy fire. He calls them, come from the holy fire. Burn in a gyre and be the singing masters of my soul. And he says, you come out of that holy fire as is shown in that music. And as if they are in that, in a gyre, it's a circling motion. They are in a circular motion. They are being moving around. They says, you come out of the holy fire and you descend upon me and become my singing master. You become my singing master so that my soul also reaches that stage, reaches that state of elevation. That means he wants to listen to the spiritual music and is not interested in the sensual music, which he had referred to in the earlier lines. He says, consume my heart away, sick with desire, fastened to a dying animal. It knows not what it is. Gather me into the artifice of eternity. Beautiful lines, Consume my heart. How is my heart? Sick with desire. I become sick of desire. Fastened, my body is fastened to a dying animal. I am a dying animal. It knows not, I know not what it is. So you take me and also place me into where you are, into the artifice, into that art form of eternity, which is imperishable, which is undying, which is immortal. You place me there. He requests. So in the last half of the third stanza, you find he says that my heart is now tied to a dying body. So I don't know what is going to happen. I am sick with the desire. And what sort of desire? These earthly desires. I'm sick of that. And I'm feeling lost. I'm not happy. So I want to be ostracized from this experience. And he's begging the wise sages to cleanse him, because he has also been affected by this sensual world. So he begs for immortality. He begs to live in that artifice of eternity forever. That then in the stanza 4, he says, once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling. So I don't want to take a physical form. So he says that I want to forego, I don't want to have my body also, but I want to live forever. So how can I live forever? So I can only be live forever as you are like painted in gold in the wall. Similarly, I also want to be hammered by the goldsmiths so that my soul is purged. When how the gold is made, the alloy it is put into fire, it is beaten, right? And then the real gold, it comes out cleansed of all impurities. So he says, I also want to become like that, because he has a great dislike for the physical and the sensual life. So he talks about the spiritual life, the golden city of Byzantium, and he addresses to the sages and requests the sages that take me where you are on the walls. And once I have renounced my body, I'll never be reborn in the same way, in the same earthly shape. He wants to reject the physical incarnation, because once you are physically incarnated, again you are subjected to mortality and death. So I want to remain immortal, as the Grecian urns, a beautiful Greece flower vases, made by through gold, enameled by gold. Beautifully it is made. And it is kept in palaces, kept in all museums, and people just go on admiring the artwork. Similarly, I will also become a piece of eternity where the past, the present, the future all will coalesce and make me timeless forever. So, this is the theme of the poem. And lastly, he says, as a golden bird, he wants to be placed on a golden bough so that he can go on singing songs of all times, the past, the present, the future, to the lords and ladies of Byzantium. So he wants that. He wants to become a bird of a golden bough, not the real bird, but the gold of the golden, the shape of a singing golden bird, so that he will sing a song of spiritual ecstasy, and the way the soul will start clapping, and people I don't want to be surrounded by young lovers, animal creatures, but by an audience, which will be elegant and intellectually high, spiritually high. So in Byzantium, I will not be affected by time. So no past, no present, no future. So I'll be immortalized in the walls as you are immortalized forever on the walls. Did you like this poem? How about this poem?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, very good.
It's a very beautiful poem, and I've explained you in detail. So once you read it, you see how, how lofty his thoughts are, and how beautifully he has intertwined the physical world and the spiritual world in this poem. And he gives a preference for the latter because that is the world which is immortal, that is the world of the soul which never dies, the world of the unaging intellect. Unaging, that means the intellect is never affected by time, or the soul never is affected by time. So this poem, I tell you, it's a very important poem for these passages that you have to come, these unseen passages which it comes. This poem you have to be very careful, because most of you'll find some lines definitely is coming, I find that. And as you have understood the poem nicely, I think you can well interpret them nicely. That'll not be a problem. So I'll talk about the Yeats's symbols. He uses a lot of symbols in his poem. He's called a symbolic poet, I'll just explain the symbols so that when you read the poems, it will be easy for you to understand. The first symbol he uses is gyre, 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 where it is like a cone. It is like a cone, that cone you use for ice cream, that sort of cone, where one end is little wider and the other side is pointed. So it is a circular or a conical shape, and it appears very frequently in Wordsworth's Yeats's poem. So he chose this image of interlocking gyres. You'll find one gyre interlocked with other gyre, and it symbolizes that all things can be described in terms of cycles and patterns. Means one cycle gives rise to another cycle. That means this is not a linear world. The past and the present and the future, it goes on, turns round and round and round, and a time will come where the world will end, not with a bang, but with a whimper. The world will end not with a bang, but with a whimper. That is one of the lines, famous lines. So it is a very difficult concept because it is an abstract image where it is waxing and waning. Because in the wider one, it is waxing, and when you go to the other end, it is waning. So it is about the evolution of a human life. from youth to adulthood to old age. The cycle of life, the cycle of time, that is how he represents it through the interlocking gyres. Because he believes in this historical determinism. What is to happen? What is called determinism? Determine means it is a predetermined world where things will happen. Can you reverse your age? No. It will happen. Can you reverse? Can you make your beauty permanent? No. It will again happen. So it is a determined, it is called determinism, where everything has been decided earlier. Nothing is constant, as it says, Anjita. It goes on changing. And we are like, you can say, as Shakespeare says, we are like actors coming for a short while and going back. We play our part. A part which you play may be a positive part or maybe a negative part. A part where you may be very joyful or you may be very sorrowful. But everyone has a role in this world, and what role he has to play is already determined. You cannot decide what you are going to do in this world. You cannot decide the next moment what you are going to do. So this is the world where we are living. It's a very slippery sort of world, very slippery. So he talks of this interlocking gyres because he believes in fate. He believes in historical determinism. And he also talks about the development of the soul. As physically we are waning, our soul is waxing. It happens. These are contradictory things. Physically you may waning, but your soul may be waxing. Your soul may be expanding. Your soul may be becoming enriched, transcendental. So it doesn't get affected by the age as physically we are getting affected. So the philosophy of history, of time, and the philosophy of spirituality is, both of them are emphasized through the image of the gyre. Yeah, it is a spiral movement. Nothing is in a circular way. Time ends where time begins. If you ask, where is the point from where life starts? You cannot define, because that is a timeless thing. The place from where you have started, you come to that point again. You cannot measure. This is the place from where I have started and this is the place where I am going to. So it is turning and turning and turning. To give a small example, physical. Whatever you are wearing today, had your great-grandmother been alive today, she would have said, yes, we were wearing that. A simple thing like fashion. Do you think it is in a cycle, it is going around? Now you take, coming to organic. What is this organic thing happening? It is again going back to the past. We are going ahead physically, but we are going back to the past. You say of millet, of this, all those things which were never heard of earlier. Those things are becoming famous. We are talking about having, you realize that we are disturbing nature. So we have started having a fondness for plants, for trees, for the animal life, which earlier was there. I remember when I was small. I don't know, you must have seen that. Of course, in your generation, I can't say, but in my generation, when we were small, there used to be a particular, a sort of earthen pot where we used to put all our peeled vegetables, the skins of vegetables, along with the water drained from the rice. Okay, when the rice was done, the water which comes out of the rice, we used to put that and we used to place it before our house. Every house had it, so that will not go waste. But maybe the cows, maybe the ox, maybe the bullocks, whoever they're going on the road, they will come and eat those or drink those. What was that? That is the sense of empathy they had for the animals. Yes, all the grandmothers, they used to do that. All the grandmothers, because that was the way of life. They coexisted. They coexisted along with nature. Their nature was a part of human nature. Nature was a part of human nature. Of course, in villages, as you say, it is being followed, but no one you'd like to, if you are telling this young generation, they don't appreciate it. If you, we're told that we used to take out some rice, raw rice, and they used to put in some containers. And when the beggars used to come, our mothers or our grannies used to be go and distribute to all the beggars, whoever have come. So we used to go and put a little handful to the beggars. Why it happened? Because that was the sense of sympathy for us. So this sense of empathy, sympathy, human values, that enriches you. What is human values? When your spirit, where you spiritually from inside, you are enriched. That is called, you are a human being with proper values. You may have all the wealth of the world, but if you are deprived of all these values, that means you are at the lowest rung of a human being. You are a man full of ego. And this ego today you have, tomorrow it is again going to be. It's not going to remain forever. It will go away one day. But the values you have, why, for example, you take Ratan Tata. He was such a rich man and with a humble beginning. But why people remember today? Not because he was wealthy like Ambani. No, because of his human values. He had a very simple life. No artificial thing. Never aspired for anything. He was very fond of stray dogs. He used to take care of the stray dogs. Even allowed the dogs to, sleep in front of the Taj Hotel, which was it's a heritage hotel of India. He was so worried. He was invited by Queen Elizabeth, but as the dog was not well, he refused to go because dog was more important. The pet dog he had. So this man has values. This man has values. He was going in a flight, and people say, "Oh, I'm this, I'm that, I'm that." The hero, there was one hero was sitting next to him, and he went on telling. He kept quiet, but while getting down, he said, "I am Ratan Tata." That means the flight in which he was sitting, it was his own flight, Air India flight. But see the humility of a person. The humility of a person, that gives the richness, that gives the immortality to a person. He will be remembered for all times. Anyone who talks about him, he'll talk something to appreciate him, not to demean him, because he's not a controversial character at all. He was a man of values. So that enriches your soul, that makes you immortal, So the second symbol, let me come to the second symbol. One was the gyre. The second symbol was the swan. Swan. Swan is a very common symbol in his poetry, especially his poem, The Leda and the Swan, The Wild Swans at Cooley Park, where the swans, he represents a very beautiful and very pure, flawless, the swans. And in a particular poem in The Leda and the Swan, he talks about Zeus, a god, who disguises himself as a swan to rape the unsuspecting leader. But in this poem, the swan is fearsome, destructive. So he says that swan here symbolizes Zeus. And he talks about the wings, he talks about the feet, about the long neck, about the big. But when he talks of swan in this poem, he talks about a divine force. That when he flaps its wings, webbed feet, so something which is very violent, which can be becoming very violent. So in his poems, especially the swan, in other poems, you'll find it is the ideal of beauty. But in his poem, swan is beautiful, but at the same time, it is very fearsome. It is beautiful, but fearsome and also terrifying. So that is the symbol of the swan he uses, especially in his two poems he uses. And then he talks of a great beast. He talks of a beast. It is a horrific, violent animal. And it has no shape. You cannot say what is the shape of that beast. And in the second coming, the poem, the second coming, the beast is the symbol of evil. The beast is the symbol of darkness. So the beast emerges. The beast will emerge from the soul of the universe. It names it, the soul of the universe, he names it as Spiritus Mundi, the soul of the universe. And its primary motive is to destroy. Its primary motive is to destroy what? Where he'll destroy the innocence, because he's the one to spread the evil. And when it will happen? When the world is coming to an end and a new age will come. And a new age will come. You'll find why this will happen? Because of the widening of the gyres. Because the gyres are, the gyres, interspersed with each other. But if they start separating, that is the time that this beast will appear, and it will lead to a frightening collapse of the universe. So that is the image of disruption, symbol of change through the horrifying monster. And this beast doesn't walk, it slouches. Slouches means to walk very sluggishly from here to there. And it is going where? It is going to Bethlehem. It is going. So this is an abstract thing, but it is slowly going to Bethlehem to be born, and as what? As an antichrist, as the second Christ. And it will be a figure for the dark new age. So he talks about the modern world. He talks about the beast which is going to a holy place to destroy. The world will collapse, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Everyone would start crying. There would be dead bodies, because the animal has arisen from the soul of the universe. And it is slowly going to the place of spirituality, where he will spread all the evil and the world is going to change. Even in Indian mythology, you find of different yugas. Dwapar Yuga, modern Yuga, Kali Yuga, this Yuga. And you find one age ends, the other age will start. But when the age is ending, you will find lot of happenings. Lot of happenings like war, like, natural disasters, disease, deaths, so that lot of people would die, and perhaps a new world will be born again. So this world is also going through cycles, one age giving to another age. So Yeats also gives the picture of such a world where it is a cyclical world. It is like a gyre moving in gyres, and once it is coming close, coalescing, the other time it is separating. So when it is separating, then that is the time the world is coming to an end. So how do you like W.B. Yeats? It is a very difficult poem, but I tried to make you understand, because Sailing to Byzantium is there in your book, and that is definitely going to come. Maybe as a long question, or maybe as a short question, or as you can say unseen
It
passage.
was interesting.
Yeah,
Mummy, it was interesting.
yeah, it is very interesting, but it's at the same time very difficult, because I cannot go line by line because I don't have the time. But still, I tried to explain you. Is if you are familiar with the concepts, then it makes it becomes easy to understand a poet. And I talked about the three symbols he always uses in his poems, and the main important poems also I have touched. And I think there are two other poems. Let me see.
Ma'am, Lapis Lazuli.
Lapis lazuli is there? I don't think so.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am, it's there. Lapis lazuli.
Lapis
Yes,
lazuli
ma'am,
is
it is
there.
there, ma'am.
And what else?
The
Goblin Market.
Christ goes for the tomb.
Easter.
Hmm? Just wait, let me go find out.
Easter 1916.
Easter, Easter 1919 is there, yeah.
Adam's curse and no second
1916.
Troy also.
1915 or 1919?
1916, ma'am.
16.
1916 is there.
Adam's Curse is also there.
But so many poems are there, but these are the early poems, the first phase of. But the later ones, like Sailing to Byzantium, this poem is a very important poem, and it's a long poem, of course. And but you can prepare one question. You'll find this poem is always coming to. I mean, in your examination, you'll find, if you see the questions, I find Sailing to Byzantium is always there. So
Ma'am, Lapis Lazuli is also there.
So in the next class, maybe we can do that lapis lazuli. But I'll just switching off my camera to find out something. Just allow me. Uh, mhm. Cool. Victorian Literature Council. So what we can do in the next class, perhaps I will cover this lapis lazuli. I will cover that poem. And the other poems are not very important poems, It's not very important. But we can go to lapis lazuli, and then I'll go cover T.S. Eliot Wasteland, which is a very important poem and a very difficult poem, both. So we have to discuss that, and then we can touch some modern poets like Philip Larkins, Ted Hughes, and some poems are there. We can touch those. So I have now one class with you tomorrow. I think on Monday I have one class, no? So what I can do is, are you free on any other day?
Tomorrow?
Yes, ma'am. Sunday would be fine.
Tomorrow I'll not be, because tomorrow I'm having one training. I'll be busy for that, so I can't give time to you. I will be coming by 6 o'clock. So I cannot.
Monday same time is also okay.
On Tuesday? Tuesday?
But you are having your class also, no? You are not having your class. 6 o'clock. Tuesday, are you free?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Tuesday, you are free.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Class on Tuesday.
Yes, madam.
Yes, ma'am.
Tuesday, you're free. Okay. Then Monday, I'll take one class. Monday is there. Monday, I will take one class. And then Tuesday, I'll take another class so that all this can be covered. Okay, we will do that Lapis Lazuli and some insignificant poems of Yeats I'll just touch upon. And then I will go to T.S. Eliot, and then I will touch the other modern poets, and then my course will be over. So if you have any questions,
Yes.
how was your experience? Let me know about that also.
Ma'am, could you please explain once again regarding the symbol of swan? I'm not clear with that swan symbol.
Swan. Swan, he says, is the symbol. He says, though it looks very radiant, beautiful, but it is very powerful at the same time. He uses the symbol in the poem called Leda and the Swan, where the swan, as a divine force, comes and rapes Leda. Because it has got webbed feet, it has got wings, it is a very big size. So he says, though beautiful, but at the same time, it is also terrible. I mean, it's a terrible beauty, you can say. The beauty which makes you fearsome, which is fearful, not fearful, fearsome, and which is very powerful. At the same time, looks very majestic. That is the symbol, and he gives the symbol only in 2 poems. You don't have. One is the Leda and the Swan, and the other is Wild Swans.
Huh?
Yes. Tell him. Any other question if you want to say? Achha, you have these meditations in the time of civil war also, no? You have this poem?
Which one, ma'am?
Meditations in the time of civil war.
I think no.
You have this poem?
No. I think
Yes, you have.
Ma'am.
Yes.
No, ma'am. No, ma'am.
Yes, you have it in your book. And one is 1919. I'm seeing that in your book. 1919. The poem is the year where the Anglo-Irish War began.
Ma'am, may I ask something?
No, you are having that, in the I think in that block, not 9 and 10, block 8, toward the end, you'll find it says 2 poems are there, 1919 and Meditations in a Civil War. I just explain you as I had, I think, prepared. I'm searching for that. I got it. Meditation is a very simple, it's a very personal, where he talks about his family history. He talks about the ancestral house and the classical sculpture of collection he has, the grandeur of the house, and the garden full of peacocks. He describes about that. But his own house, he says, is contrasted to that of his ancestor. It is not so classical in its beauty, but it is wild, unkempt. The roses are growing in its garden, and it's a very roses is a very important figure again, because it talks about the Ireland, where Ireland was very full of roses. So he talks about the luxury of the ancestors, where everything was very beautiful, everything was good collection, splendor, grandeur. But about himself, when he comes, about his own house, he says, in comparison, it's not like that. So he says that it is, in the series of Tower poems, he had written a Tower poem. The series of the collection was called the Tower. He says that this particular house, this particular moment, is that it is not a fit place, but what will make him immortal is his poetry, not the place, not the beauty of the house. So he says the tower, the poem, Tower is a collection of his poems. He says, this tower will be my monument. Even my writing may fail, but what I have created through the tower, that will remain as the classical world remains, the beauty of the classical world remains. Similarly, my descendants would definitely appreciate the tower. So he says, now he talks of the Irish life, of their war, of the soldiers, and he talks about death, he talks about weather, he talks about civil war. But he says, my tower, the world of my poetry, is far away from this war, from this actual suffering. So he wants to break away from all these strings of the past and wants to climb to the top of the tower, because the tower is your image of creation. Top of the tower, to view the situation from above. Then only he will realize, if you look from above, that all this war, all this mob, it's nothing, but they're all gripped by madness. So this is a poem of reflection, where the poet wants to distance himself from this Republican movement, these Irish wars, the civil wars, and wants to create his own world, which will be far from all this animosity, all this, war, all this, you can say, the mean feelings of human beings. But it will be something which will be created by his intellectual wealth, the tower. So that was one of his poems. And again, in his 1919, he talks about, again, the Anglo-Irish War, not a very important poem. And he talks about how there was destruction of art in Ireland. And it talks about the Ireland Republican Army, which are fighting the war in the Anglo-Irish War. He talks about bloodlust. And he says, at the end of the poem, he says that destruction is not only about the art of the great houses have not been destroyed, the artwork has not been destroyed, but what has destroyed is the thought of mankind. All these wars have affected the thought of mankind. So he makes a mockery of all this. And he says that violence that is sweeping in Ireland is very seductive in nature. It starts, attracting people, seductive. The horses, the men, they all go into it without fear, because they are affected, they are motivated by the evil forces, the brute feelings. And these feelings are very sinister in nature, very sinister, very negative in nature. That is what it describes the Anglo-Irish War. These are the two poems that is there in your book. So I think we can end here today. And in the next class, that is on Monday, I'll take your class. And that day we'll do the Iliad. And the next, the wrapping up class, we'll do the touch. But in the meantime, I've already told you, because I will not have time, because actually my course is over. I'm taking an extra class of my own choice with you. Please go and see the question papers. I've been telling you. Go to the site of IGNOU, www.ignou.ac.in, find out from the Students' Corner the question papers, see the question papers, how they are coming, whether it is questions appear familiar to you, or you find it very difficult, so that at least we can give 15-20 minutes to the question discussions, that is the questions that is coming, at least the 3 years question paper, both the sessions, right? Both sessions you're having examination. So both the sessions, 3 years, we can have the question papers. So today I think we can end the session. Its time is over. Okay. So good night to all of you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Meet on Monday.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
So you like my
Thank you,
lectures?
ma'am.
That makes me happy that at least you're understanding the topics.
Yes, ma'am, we do.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Okay then. Okay. Bye.